The lava stopped moving sometime in the late summer of 864 AD. It had traveled northwest from the slopes of Mount Fuji across open ground, a slow and enormous weight of molten basaltic rock spreading itself across the terrain until its own cooling finally overcame the pressure pushing it forward, and it settled, flat, dark, and still across the plain. There were no trees on it. There were no birds in it, no insects moving through it, no moss threading into its surface yet. There was only the rock, black and faintly warm in the late summer air, and the silence of a landscape that had just been remade from the ground up. The wind moved across it freely. There was nothing to stop the wind. The whole field of cooling lava lay open to the sky in every direction, and if a seed landed on it in those first weeks, it found nothing to hold in, nothing soft enough to receive it, nothing but the dense and indifferent surface of new volcanic stone. This is where Aokigahara begins, not with the forest that exists now, not with the dense canopy and the mossy floor and the particular stillness that has come to define the place, but with that bare field of cooling rock and the long patience of what came after. The eruption that produced it is recorded in a 9th century Japanese chronicle called the Sandai Jitsuroku, one of the 6 official histories of the early imperial court. The record describes the event in the language of official documentation: a great eruption from Fuji, an outpouring of fire, the destruction of farms and forest across the northwestern plain. What the chronicle records as catastrophe was also, though no one living through it would have thought to frame it this way, the beginning of something. The lava field left behind by the Jogan eruption would, over the centuries that followed, become one of the densest and most ecologically particular forests in Japan. But that transformation would take a very long time, and in its early stages, it was almost invisible, a matter of single seeds, single spores, the narrowest green threads of life, finding the narrowest cracks in bare volcanic stone. The terrain that became Aokigahara sits at the northwestern base of Mount Fuji in what is now Yamanashi Prefecture. The forest covers approximately 35 square kilometers of the lava plain, and its boundaries are partly defined by water. Lake Sai lies to its east, and Lake Shoji to its south, 2 of the Fuji 5 lakes formed in the volcanic geography of the region. Standing at the forest's eastern edge, the lake is visible through the last few trees, a pale and open expanse of water reflecting whatever sky sits above it. Walking inward, the trees close behind. After a certain number of steps, the lake disappears. The trees are the same in every direction. The ground is the same in every direction. The canopy above is the same closed and continuous green, and whatever the sky is doing, whether the light is bright or dim, whether clouds are moving or still, it is not easily seen from the interior. The forest holds its own light. What makes that interior so different from other dense woodlands is partly a matter of sound. Most forests contain moving water. The ear expects it, the distant sound of a stream, the small irregular drip of water collecting and falling from leaf to leaf, the larger movement of a creek somewhere in the middle distance. These sounds are so ordinary in woodland that they are almost not heard consciously. They form part of the background against which everything else is noticed. In Aokigahara, they are absent. The forest floor rests on basaltic lava that is riddled throughout with cavities, hollow channels, and pockets, and fissures formed as the molten rock moved and cooled and contracted. Rain falls on the forest surface, and instead of collecting, instead of running, instead of pooling on flat stone, or threading downward in any audible way, it simply disappears. It drops through the surface of the lava into the network of spaces below, and it is gone, No puddle forms, no trickle sounds across any surface. The water goes silently into the rock as if the rock is drinking it, and the forest floor above remains dry and still. The effect of this is that one entire category of forest sound is simply not present in Aokigahara, whatever the ear is accustomed to using as a kind of audio anchor. The stream that marks the low point of the ground, the creek that runs along the valley, finds nothing to locate here. The silence is not the silence of a quiet day in an ordinary forest. It is structurally different from that. It is the silence of a place where a whole range of expected sounds has been removed, leaving the air in the interior of the forest thicker and more uniform than air usually feels. Wind compounds this. The canopy of Aokigahara is densely layered and continuous. No significant clearings break its surface. No wide gaps let the wind descend to ground level. On days when the open slopes of Mount Fuji above the forest are swept by a strong and consistent breeze, that same air reaches the edge of the tree line and is stopped. Not entirely. A faint movement occasionally finds its way through the canopy at the forest's edge, particularly during storms, but at ground level in the interior, the air is largely still. The wind that works freely across the mountain above simply does not reach the floor of Aokigahara. It slides across the top of the canopy and continues, and below it the forest keeps its own atmosphere, separate and quiet. Standing in that interior, with no wind and no water sound, and the canopy overhead closing out most of the sky, the quality of the silence changes from simply quiet to something more specific. It becomes noticeable as a thing in itself. Most silences are broken before they can be fully registered. A bird call, a distant engine, the movement of wind in leaves, the ambient sound of the world going about its business, just out of sight. In Aokigahara's interior on a still day, those interruptions are fewer and further between. The silence gathers. It has weight. It is the kind of quiet that a person becomes aware of, rather than simply not noticing noise. All of this has a physical explanation. The silence is produced by specific physical facts. The lava substrate draining water without sound, the canopy thickness suppressing wind, the density of the woodland limiting the travel of outside noise into the interior. There is nothing mysterious in the origin of it, but the experience of it standing inside that particular quiet, aware of it the way one becomes aware of a change in pressure, is its own kind of fact, entirely separate from its cause. The volcanic rock that produced this environment is basalt, and it is worth understanding what basalt is before considering what it became here. Basalt forms from low viscosity magma, lava that flows relatively easily and travels considerable distances before cooling. The Jogan eruption produced lava of this kind, fluid enough to spread across the broad plain northwest of the mountain, rather than piling up near the vent. As it moved, it behaved in the ways that flowing basalt typically behaves. The surface cooled faster than the interior, forming a hardened crust while molten rock continued moving below it, eventually draining away and leaving the crust hollow. Tubes formed this way, long cylindrical spaces inside the rock where lava once moved. Smaller cavities formed where gas bubbled out of the cooling stone. The entire solidified field was porous, at scales ranging from fine surface texture to chambers large enough to stand in, connected by the network of fissures and voids that makes the lava behave, in relation to water, almost like a sponge. The surface of this rock in 864 AD was hard and dark and essentially bare. There are photographs taken in modern times of lava fields newly produced by other eruptions in other parts of the world, the Hawaiian Islands, Iceland, the Canary Islands, that gives some sense of what the Aokigahara terrain looked like in the years immediately after the Jogan event. The rock is dark, almost black in many lights, with a surface texture that ranges from smooth and ropey in places where the lava moved slowly to rough and broken where it fractured as it cooled. It is hostile to immediate colonization by most plants. The surfaces are hard. The temperature fluctuations between day and night on a dark surface absorbing full sun are severe. There is no soil in the conventional sense, no accumulated organic matter, no bacterial community, no structure capable of retaining moisture or providing the chemical environment that most plant roots require. What arrives first in these conditions is what can tolerate the conditions: mosses and lichens, organisms that need only bare rock and occasional moisture to establish themselves, that can survive desiccation and return to activity when wet, that grow slowly and build, over time, the first thin layer of organic material above the stone. Lichen in particular is often the pioneer, fixing itself to rock surfaces, secreting acids that slowly work on the mineral composition of the stone, contributing its own tissue when it dies, to the thin accumulation of organic matter that will, over decades and centuries, become the foundation for something more complex. The seeds that arrived on the Aokigahara lava field in the decades and centuries after 864 AD came mostly on the wind. The species that succeeded first were likely those with airborne seeds, capable of landing in a narrow crevice in the rock and finding enough moisture from condensation and occasional rain to germinate, even in the absence of any developed soil. The image of this early colonization is almost impossibly slow by the standards of a human lifespan. The rock bare, then faintly green at its crevices, then crossed by the first thin root, threads, then eventually supporting the first small woody plants, and finally, after what would have been many human generations, beginning to look like woodland. The canopy that exists now took centuries to produce. The trees of Aokigahara are not recent arrivals. The largest and oldest individuals in the forest have root systems that have spent generations working their way across the surface of the lava, finding every crack and hollow, holding on by the accumulated grip of decades of slow lateral growth. The forest floor, which is so distinctive to anyone who walks into Aokigahara, the mossy green surface crossed in every direction by exposed roots, the lava rock visible in the spaces between them, is the direct record of this long process. The roots are on the surface because the rock below is largely impenetrable to downward growth. They spread outward because that is the only direction available to them. The mossy surface between them is the centuries of accumulated organic matter that the forest has built, very slowly, on top of bare volcanic stone. Knowing this changes the texture of what it looks like to stand inside Aokigahara. The moss underfoot is not merely pleasant and soft, it is old. It is the product of a sequence of slow transformations stretching back over 1,000 years, each one adding a fraction of a millimeter to the depth of organic material, each dead organism contributing its small body to the layer below the living surface. The tangled root structure is not merely picturesque, it is the record of every generation of tree that has lived and died in this forest, each one working the same problem of how to hold on to basaltic rock, each one finding the same solution of spreading sideways and gripping whatever surface was available. The silence of the interior is not merely incidental, it is produced by the same porous volcanic geology that has shaped everything else about how the forest lives. Mount Fuji stands above all of this, visible when the forest edge is crossed and the canopy opens enough to allow a long view upward. The mountain is the obvious origin of what lies at its base, its symmetrical cone, its height, its position in the landscape, all announce that this is the source of the volcanic plain below. But the mountain relationship with the forest is not only a matter of geological origin. Fuji is a living volcano, dormant since its last eruption in 1707, but not extinct, and the forest at its base exists within the geological context of a mountain that has shaped this landscape repeatedly over its long history, not once. The 864 AD Jogan eruption was one event in a much longer sequence. Fuji has erupted many times over its history, producing lava flows and ash deposits at different periods that together make up the geological foundation of the entire region. The Aokigahara lava field is a relatively recent feature in this long sequence, 1,000 years old as young by the standards of the mountain above it. It is possible to think of the forest as a kind of pause in a much longer process, the ground between eruptions, slowly softening and greening, life returning to bare rock until the next disruption begins the sequence again. But 1,000 years is also a very long time by the standards of anything living. The trees in Aokigahara have lived within that pause for many generations. The ecological community that exists in the forest now, its fern species, its mosses, its roost sites, its seasonal rhythms, is the product of a long and patient process of establishment and deepening, and it feels inside the forest like a place that has been exactly what it is for a very long time. The quiet is 1,000 years of quiet, accumulated. The lava field itself is not flat in any simple sense. The surface of solidified basalt rarely is. The movement of the rock as it cooled produced a terrain of very low but complex variation, slightly raised here, slightly depressed there. The surface broken by the outlines of old lava tubes, by places where the crust cracked and settled, by the shallow basins where organic matter collected most readily, and the forest grew first and thickest. Walking across the Aokigahara floor requires attention, not because the terrain is dramatically difficult, but because the surface is uneven in a way that is not always obvious beneath the moss. The root networks above the rock and the thick moss covering them produce a floor that looks more uniform than it is. Steps that seem level occasionally find the foot lower or higher than expected, finding a hidden depression in the rock below the soft surface. This is part of what makes the interior of the forest disorienting in a very particular way. The canopy is uniform, the trees are continuous, the ground appears flat and uniform. Every direction offers the same visual information, and yet the forest is also subtly uneven, subtly varied, full of the small irregularities of volcanic terrain covered by 1,000 years of organic accumulation. The disorientation is mild. It builds slowly. A person walking in a straight line in the forest interior, or attempting to, may find the line is not quite straight, the course deviating slowly around root clusters and subtle changes in terrain until the original direction has been lost and the forest looks the same behind as it does ahead. Without a stream to follow, without a slope pronounced enough to give the sense of walking consistently uphill or down, without wind to carry information about what lies ahead or in any direction, the forest interior keeps its secrets. Not aggressively, not in any way that feels hostile or threatening. It simply has no landmarks, and without landmarks, space behaves differently. The same quality of uniformity extends upward. The canopy above the interior of Aokigahara, viewed from within, presents a continuous and layered surface that admits light without revealing much about the sky above it. On clear days, the quality of the light is bright but diffuse, filtered through multiple layers of leaf and branch before it reaches the ground. On overcast days, the light is dim and consistent, with no variation to indicate where the sun might be in the sky above. The time of day is less legible than it would be in a more open environment. The sense of being inside a space rather than moving across open ground is persistent and quite specific. From above, the forest presents a different aspect entirely. The canopy of Aokigahara, seen from the slopes of Fuji above it, or from the right vantage point near its edges, is continuous and compact, a surface of dense green stretching without break across the full 35 square kilometers of the lava plain. No clearings interrupt it. No rivers cut through it. The flat volcanic plain below seems designed to hold the forest as a single unified surface, without the variation in terrain that would normally produce gaps and open spaces in a woodland this size. It lies at the mountain's base like something placed there, a dense, closed, unbroken plain of green, its edges defined by the lake shores, to the east and south, and by the gradual thinning into agricultural land and smaller woodland on its other sides. What it does not show from above is the silence inside it. That silence is the forest's most persistent quality, and it outlasts every other impression. Visitors who have walked in Aokigahara and written about the experience return to it repeatedly, not as a dramatic feature, but as the thing that stays. The forest is full of life. Birds, insects, the small sounds of wind finding its way through the canopy at the edges, the distant calls of birds in the upper branches. It is not dead or empty, but all of these sounds occur within a space whose baseline is unusually quiet, and the effect is to make each individual sound more distinct, more separate, more present than it would be in a noisier environment. A single bird call in the interior of Aokigahara lands in silence. It does not blend into ambient noise. It arrives, and then the silence returns. This is, in the end, a physical fact about a particular piece of ground, a volcanic plain that drains water silently and blocks wind at its surface, covered by a forest dense enough to produce its own atmosphere. The geology is the explanation. The centuries of slow ecological accumulation are the mechanism. The result is a forest that feels, to anyone who spends time inside it, unlike most other forests, not because of anything added to it by story or legend or history, but simply because of the specific physical circumstances of the ground it grows on. 12 centuries have passed since the Jogan eruption left this plain bare and black and silent in the late summer air. The first seeds to land on it carried on the same mountain wind that still moves freely across the open slopes above, found the narrowest possible foothold in the narrowest possible crevices of cooling rock. The organisms that followed them were small and slow, mosses and lichens that grew by fractions of centimeters in a year, building the thinnest possible layer of organic material on the hard volcanic surface, beginning the work of softening a terrain that would take centuries to become what it is now. The forest that stands today over that same terrain is old, not old by the standards of deep geological time. 1,000 years is barely a moment in the history of the volcanic mountain that produced it, but old by the measure of the organisms living in it, old by the measure of the accumulation visible in the depth of the moss and the thickness of the roots and the height of the canopy above. It took all of that time, all of those slow generations of growth and death and accumulation to produce the specific silence of Aokigahara's interior. 35 square kilometers of closed canopy over a volcanic plain, rainwater falling on its surface and disappearing silently into the rock below. Wind stopped at the tree line, held back from a ground level interior that keeps its own still air. No streams, no audible flow, no movement of water across any surface. The trees holding the lava rock in the patient lateral grip of roots that have nowhere else to go. The moss recording, in its depth, the centuries of slow transformation from bare volcanic stone to something living and continuous. The silence has no single point of origin. It is produced by everything at once, the geology and the hydrology, and the thickness of the canopy, and the density of the root mat, and the specific history of a lava field slowly covered by 1,000 years of growth. All of these things together produce a particular quality of air in the forest interior, and that quality, once noticed, settles over the whole experience of the place, like something that has been there all along, which it has. Since long before there was anyone to notice it, the forest has been quiet in this way. The lava below has been draining rainwater silently for 12 centuries. The canopy has been blocking wind for as long as the canopy has existed. The silence of Aokigahara is not a recent development. It is older than most of the stories told about the forest. It was there before the legends arrived. It will be there after them. At the forest's edge, where the last trees thin and the ground opens and Lake Sai comes into view, pale and wide and reflecting the sky, the air changes, the wind finds the face again, the sound of open water arrives. The world outside the forest resumes its ordinary acoustic texture, and what was present inside the trees becomes briefly legible by contrast, the specific accumulated quiet of a place that has been growing slowly over volcanic rock for more than 1,000 years, carrying in its silence the whole long record of everything that made it. A few steps back into the trees, and the lake disappears. The wind stops. The ground beneath the moss is the same dark basaltic rock it has always been, still faintly holding the magnetic record of the day it cooled, still draining rainwater silently into its hollow interior, still doing what it has done since the lava stopped moving and the first seeds arrived on the wind, and the forest began, patiently and without interruption, to grow. The silence gathers in. It settles. It has the quality of something that does not need anything else, not explanation, not addition, not revision. Just the 35 square kilometers of closed green canopy and the volcanic plain below it, and the particular stillness that the two of them together have been quietly producing, season after season, for over 1,000 years. A Shinto priest stands at the edge of Aokigahara just before dawn, facing the tree line, with a narrow strip of folded white paper held between his fingers. Behind him, the ground is open. The air moves freely. A little way off, the road is still dark and empty, the kind of quiet that belongs to the hour before the world remembers itself. Ahead of him, the forest is a different kind of quiet, entirely. It does not feel like absence. It feels more like a held breath. He does not step forward yet. There is something to do first, here at the boundary, in the space between the open air he is standing in and the still air waiting among the trees. The ritual he performs is small and precise. He holds the paper strip so that it catches what little breeze remains on this side of the canopy, then moves it through a sequence of positions that have not changed in several centuries. He carries a wooden box with a sliding lid. He carries a bundle of dried branches tied with cord. The objects themselves are not unusual. What matters is their arrangement and the specific place where they are used, and the fact that this threshold, not any other edge of woodland, not any other quiet grove, has been understood for a very long time as a place that merits this particular attention. He finishes. He replaces the items in the box. Then he steps forward, and the air closes around him, and the tree line that had been ahead of him is now behind. In traditional Shinto cosmology, the world was not divided cleanly between the living and the dead. It was divided between spaces where human life gathered and ordered itself, and spaces where something older and less ordered persisted. Mountains held it, river mouths held it, dense, lightless forests held it especially. The word for this quality, the sense of sacred or spiritually charged ground, came with obligations attached. Such places were not avoided. They were approached carefully. A forest like Aokigahara, with its closed canopy and its unusual stillness and its floor of black volcanic rock half hidden under pale moss, was precisely the kind of landscape that collected this attention. The dense stands of hinoki and oak pressing in from every direction, the way sound dampened almost immediately, a few steps past the tree line, the invisible geography of the lava field beneath. All of it produced an atmosphere that local tradition found coherent with what it already believed about certain kinds of wild ground. Local shrines maintained a relationship with Aokigahara over centuries that was more practical than fearful. Priests entered the forest regularly, not only to perform purification rites at the boundary, but to tend to the spiritual conditions of the interior, which were understood to require ongoing attention rather than a single declaration that the place had been made safe. And the forest was considered in the specific vocabulary of local belief, a dwelling place for Oni, a category of entity translated often too simply into English as demon, but carrying more ambivalence than that translation suggests. Oni in classical Japanese tradition were powerful, unpredictable, and associated with boundaries, the edges of settlement, the threshold between seasons, the moment between life and its ending. Encountering one was not necessarily fatal. It was simply an encounter with something that obeyed different rules than the ones that governed daily human life. A priest who entered properly prepared, who had performed the right actions at the right threshold in the right order, was understood to be in a different relationship with whatever the forest contained than someone who walked in casually. The Oni of Aokigahara, in local oral tradition, were not primarily described in the way later literary and illustrated depictions would render them, not the red-faced, club-wielding figures of popular imagination. They were described more obliquely. Storytellers spoke of a heaviness in certain parts of the forest, a sensation that the ground was paying attention. They described the feeling of moving in a direction and arriving, after some time, at a place that looked exactly like where one had started. The disorientation was attributed to entities whose relationship with the human idea of space was different from the human experience of it. Whether this attribution explains something genuinely happening or simply gave shape to the very real navigational challenges the forest posed, the stories served a similar purpose in either case. They marked the forest as a place deserving of careful entry. They preserved, across generations, a kind of inherited caution that turned out to have practical usefulness. Yurei occupied a different category in the traditional cosmology from Oni. Where Oni were entities that had perhaps never been human, Yurei were precisely and entirely human, or had been, recently enough that the grief of their leaving had not yet resolved into anything quieter. The concept describes spirits unable to move through the expected passage from life into whatever came after, held in place by some form of unfinished feeling, rage, longing, sorrow, so profound it could not be released even by death. They were bound, in traditional belief, to the physical location where that feeling had become concentrated, not to their bodies necessarily, but to a place, a room, a stretch of road, a section of shoreline, a forest. Aokigahara accumulated yurei in local oral tradition, the way certain places accumulate names, gradually, through repetition, through the layering of individual stories, into a shared understanding. The specific descriptions of what people claim to have seen along the forest's edge at dusk had a consistency that is worth noting, not because consistency makes a ghost more real, but because it tells something about how a community's imagination moves when it returns to the same ground repeatedly. The figures described were pale, which placed them in a long visual tradition of Japanese representations of the dead. They moved slowly. Their feet were positioned slightly above the surface of the ground, rather than in contact with it, a detail that appears in classical woodblock representations of yuri, and that reappears in the oral accounts with enough regularity to suggest the stories were in conversation with the visual tradition, each reinforcing and extending the other. They were most often seen at the hour when the light between the trees dropped from gray to almost nothing, when the boundary between the interior of the forest and the air outside grew less certain, when the eye began to find shapes in things that had no shapes. The descriptions were never frightened, in quite the tone one might expect. They were careful, they were attentive in the way of someone who had seen something that required attention without requiring alarm. The figures glimpsed at the forest's edge were not described as rushing toward anyone or making sounds. They were simply present in the specific way that things are present when they have nowhere else to be. The storytelling tradition that preserved these accounts was not primarily a tradition of horror. It was a tradition of geography, a way of describing what the forest contained, in the same breath as describing its tree species and its volcanic floor, and the way the air behaved differently inside it. The yurei were part of the forest's ecology, in a manner of speaking. They belonged to its specific local character, the way the stillness and the porous rock belong to it. There is a strand of local tradition connected to Aokigahara that carries a different kind of weight, something quieter and more sorrowful than the accounts of Oni or the pale figures at dusk. It concerns the forest's relationship with the very old, the very ill, and the very poor. The practice given the name ubasoti in Japanese literary tradition described the carrying of elderly or infirm relatives into remote wilderness, the act of leaving them there. The word itself means, roughly, abandoning grandmother. It appears in classical poetry, in medieval tales, in folk tales and moral parables going back many centuries, and it surfaces repeatedly in the oral and written traditions associated specifically with Aokigahara. Historians examining the documentary record have found very little evidence that yubasut was a widespread or systematically practiced custom in historical Japan. What the record does show is that the image of abandonment in remote wilderness, the old figure sitting just inside the tree line, surrounded by the deep hush of old trees, left there by people who had perhaps no other choice, was a powerful enough idea to generate stories across many centuries and many regions. The practice may have occurred in isolated cases, as it has in most human societies under conditions of extreme scarcity. What it became, more significantly, was a figure for a particular kind of grief, the grief of families unable to provide, of individuals left to be absorbed by a landscape that did not distinguish between the living and the dead. Aokigahara, with its capacity for stillness and its long association with spirits, became one of the primary locations onto which this image was mapped. The figure in these stories is not typically described in terms that emphasize suffering, which is itself a notable quality. The old person sitting inside the tree line is described as still, as settled. The grief is present, but it is not the character's grief. It belongs more to the listener, to the person hearing the story and understanding what has occurred. The forest receives the figure in these accounts without drama. The trees do not move. The moss is soft and continuous. There is a kind of terrible gentleness to the image, and it is this quality, not horror, but a grief so old it has become landscape, that made these stories persist. They continued to be told because they described something real about the experience of certain kinds of loss, and because the forest itself, with its particular silence and its ancient volcanic floor, provided a setting that did not contradict the feeling. The lava rock beneath Aokigahara is riddled with hollow channels and irregular cavities that extend for considerable distances in some directions, running in complex networks beneath the surface of the forest floor. On most days, these channels are simply geological fact, part of the porous substrate that allows water to drain silently downward rather than collecting in puddles or running in any stream the ear could find. But on rare occasions, when weather conditions bring a particular kind of wind from a particular direction, and the pressure above and below the surface shifts in a way that does not happen often, the hollow channels produce a sound. It is described in local tradition as something between a murmur and a low, soft roar. It moves without a clear direction. It rises from below rather than arriving from any point on the compass. And the quality that made it remarkable to the people who heard it was that it sounded unmistakably like water, like the sound of a slow ocean wave moving over a distant shore, arriving from underground. The concept this sound was connected to in local tradition, something resembling the idea of nami no oto, the sound of waves, was understood in Aokigahara's storytelling tradition as the forest speaking. More precisely, as what lived beneath the forest speaking. The low oceanic murmur was interpreted as a collective voice, the voice of whatever had gathered in the lava channels over the centuries, communicating in a register below the threshold of meaning, but not below the threshold of feeling. Storytellers described hearing it as an experience that produced not fear, but a kind of attentive stillness, the specific alertness of someone who has been addressed in a language they cannot quite parse, but recognizes as language nonetheless. The geophysical explanation for this sound involves pressure differentials, the specific geometry of the hollow lava tubes, and the rare meteorological conditions that allow wind to enter certain channels at the right angle and speed to produce resonance. The explanation is complete and thoroughly physical. It does not require anything to be down there. What is interesting is that the people who heard the sound and told stories about it were, in their own terms, also describing something thoroughly real, a forest whose geology produced a sound no other forest made, a sound that came from underground without warning on certain still days, a sound that behaved like a voice even though no voice was present. Both descriptions are, in their own frameworks, accurate. Seiko Matsumoto was born in Fukuoka in 1909 and became, over the course of his long career, one of the most widely read Japanese novelists of the 20th century. His work was meticulous, deeply rooted in social observation, and concerned throughout with the ways that ordinary people could find themselves caught between the structures that shaped their lives and the private desires and griefs those structures could not accommodate. He was not a supernatural writer. He was not a horror writer. He wrote about detectives and criminals and business people and the quiet accumulation of social pressures, and he wrote about them in a prose style that valued precision and atmosphere in roughly equal measure. When he wrote about a landscape, the landscape mattered. It did not simply provide a backdrop for the events that occurred within it. It participated in them. In 1960, Matsumoto published a novel called Kuroijukai. The words mean, in direct translation, Black Sea of Trees. The novel is a mystery, structured around the investigation of events that have taken place in a dense, dark forest. The forest Matsumoto chose for the novel's final and most consequential scene was not invented. It was Aokigahara. He described it with the attentiveness he brought to everything he chose to describe carefully. The way the canopy reduced the light, the particular quality of the silence, the sense that direction became unreliable once the trees closed in from all sides. And then, in the novel's ending, he placed two fictional people inside that real forest and gave them a decision to make. The decision they made was to die there together. The novel sold widely. It was reprinted many times. It entered the mainstream of Japanese literary culture in the way that certain books do, not as a niche or specialized text, but as something that a large portion of the reading public encountered, talked about, and retained in memory. And what it did, in the process of its enormous readership, was perform a transformation on Aokigahara that the forest itself had no role in and no knowledge of. It took all the existing layers of local tradition, the oni, the yurei, the stillness, the murmur from underground, the old figure at the tree line, and placed them inside a modern fictional narrative with a specific and particular ending. The forest was no longer only a place of traditional folklore and ancient belief. It was now also the place where Matsumoto's lovers had gone. It was inside a story that 1 million people had read. And once a landscape is inside a story that 1 million people carry in their heads, the relationship between the story and the place begins to run in both directions. The novel's readers who had never seen Aokigahara would, when they thought about the forest, see it partly through Matsumoto's prose. And the novel's readers who did later see Aokigahara would bring with them the weight of the ending they already knew. The trees would be the same trees, the silence would be the same silence, but the story would be there too, layered over the volcanic rock and the pale moss, invisible and complete. This is not unusual in the history of landscapes in literature. Certain places carry particular books so completely that it becomes difficult to visit them without the book arriving also. But Aokigahara was already a site of accumulated meaning before Matsumoto wrote a word about it. The fictional ending he gave to his lovers landed on ground that had been prepared over centuries to receive exactly that kind of weight. The existing tradition of grief and spirits, and the forest as a threshold space, made the novel's ending feel to Japanese readers not implausible but coherent, as if the story had always been there, waiting for someone to write it down. What Matsumoto's novel did, in scholarly assessment, was take a set of locally held traditions and mythologies and give them a form that could travel through modern publishing and amass readership in a way that oral tradition and regional folklore could not. It translated the forest's accumulated meaning into a medium legible to the whole country at once. Japanese scholars studying the relationship between literary fiction and site-specific cultural mythology have noted that Kuroijukai is one of the clearest examples in modern Japanese literature of kase, a single work, reshaping how an entire culture pictures a real place, not inventing the meaning, but consolidating it, giving it an address that everyone now shared. The traditions that gathered around Aokigahara before Matsumoto wrote about it are worth sitting with individually, because each of them was doing something specific. The Oni stories preserved a relationship between the local population and the forest that kept the forest respected, rather than approached carelessly. The Yuri accounts gave shape to the experience of the forest at dusk, when its visual qualities, the fading light, the uniform trunks, the soft ground, produced something that the eye and the imagination processed together, The Ubasut tradition carried a grief that was social as much as supernatural, a story about what happens at the edge of what human communities can sustain, and what a landscape receives when human capacity runs out. The Nami no Oto accounts preserved an accurate report of something the forest floor occasionally did, a geological fact rendered in mythological language that was not less true for that rendering. Each of these traditions was a form of knowledge about the forest, developed by people who spent time near it or in it over many generations. The knowledge was shaped by the available frameworks, spirit belief, cosmological understanding, the vocabulary of Shinto, but the observations it was built on were in most cases observations of real things: the silence, the disorientation, the rare subterranean sound, the visual quality of the forest at the edge of dark. The mythological framework and the physical reality were not in opposition. They were in conversation, each lending the other a kind of coherence that neither could provide alone. By the time Matsumoto published Kuroi Jukai in 1960, the forest's mythological accumulation had been building for well over 1,000 years. The Jogan eruption that created the lava field beneath the trees had occurred in 864 AD, and the forest that grew over that field in the centuries following had been, for much of its existence, a forest at the edge of habitation, known, named, storied, tended by the priests of nearby shrines, discussed in the oral tradition of nearby villages. The stories had had a long time to settle into the landscape, a very long time to become indistinguishable, at certain hours and in certain lights, from the landscape itself. Matsumoto was not writing mythology. He was writing a novel in a tradition of literary fiction with the specific goals and methods of that tradition. But the ground he chose to set his novel's final scene on was ground that had been receiving meaning for centuries, and the meaning he added, fictional, contemporary, rooted in a specific kind of modern Japanese grief about love and the constraints placed on it, was not incompatible with what was already there. It settled in alongside the rest. The forest absorbed it, the way it absorbed everything else, without moving, without acknowledgement, with the specific patience of a place that has been receiving the weight of human attention for a very long time. The story of how a single printed book can permanently alter the way a real place is experienced is, in one sense, a story about the particular power of literature, but it is also a story about the particular kind of readiness that some places carry. Not every landscape could have absorbed a fictional suicide pact and made it feel to 1,000,000 readers as if it had always belonged there. Aokigahara could. The layers of tradition that preceded Matsumoto had, over centuries, made the forest into exactly the kind of place where that kind of weight could settle without feeling displaced or implausible. The priest who performed his purification rite at the tree line was working with a framework that preceded all of this, preceding the novel, preceding the modern period, preceding the specific shape that the forest's mythology would take over the course of recorded Japanese history. What he was doing at the boundary was acknowledging that this particular stretch of forest required a particular kind of attention. The acknowledgement had been maintained across many generations before him and would be maintained across many generations after, the specific actions changing in their details, while the underlying recognition remained that this ground had gathered something over its long existence that deserved to be approached with care. The novel now sits on the shelves of 1,000,000 households across Japan, a printed object with a cover, a title, a specific page count. The words inside it are Matsumoto's words, crafted in a specific decade, for readers he could imagine but not meet. The forest he wrote about is not the forest in the book, The forest is 35 square kilometers of closed canopy over volcanic rock, with its porous lava floor and its acoustically still interior, and its slow-spreading root systems, and its particular quality of light. It exists entirely independently of having been written about. The moss continues to grow. The hollow channels in the lava continue to wait for the right wind. The tree line continues to receive whatever arrives at its edge. Birdsong at dawn, the slow movements of animals through the undergrowth, the particular pause that people tend to make when they reach it. Matsumoto's novel is inside the forest now, in the way that a story, once it attaches to a real place, with enough weight and enough readership, becomes part of the place's identity in the minds of everyone who encounters it. A Japanese reader in 1960, closing the book's final pages, setting it on a table in a lit room, would carry Aokigahara with them from that moment, not the geological formation, not the lava tubes, or the magnetic anomalies, or the copper pheasant moving through the hemlock understory, but the specific image of two people walking into that particular dark and the forest receiving them as it receives everything, without movement and without comment, in its long, undemonstrative silence. That image is now part of the forest's life in the world's imagination. The forest itself, on the other side of Japan from where most of those readers sat, continued exactly as it had. The trees grew as they had grown, laterally and slowly, across the volcanic rock. The silence held, as it held through every other hour of every other day. The stories accumulated around it, the way moss accumulates over stone, gradually, without urgency, covering everything in the same continuous soft green, making it difficult after a long time to see where the stone ends and the living thing begins. The forest floor of Aokigahara is not what most woodland floors look like. Standing still inside the trees, the first thing that draws the eye downward is the moss, a continuous, close-fitting layer of deep green that covers nearly every surface within reach, clinging to the lava rock below and to the roots that travel across it, softening every edge until the ground looks less like soil and less like stone and more like something in between, something that has been slowly accumulating its texture for centuries. A few centimeters from where a foot might rest, a single fern frond has uncurled from a narrow crevice in the basalt, pale green and slightly translucent at its tip, new enough that it still holds the curled shape it had before it opened. The roots cross and recross the surface in every direction, thick in some places and fine in others, all of them traveling laterally rather than downward, all of them gripping the rock the way a hand grips something it cannot afford to let go. This is where the forest's unusual character begins to make itself felt, not in its mythology or its silence or its volcanic origins, but in the specific texture of the ground beneath the trees, where what grows and how it grows is a direct consequence of what lies beneath. The basaltic lava that underlies all of Aokigahara is largely impenetrable. Roots cannot push through it. They cannot sink in the way roots sink through ordinary soil, drawing water from depth and anchoring themselves against wind. Instead, every tree in this forest has made a different arrangement with its substrate, one worked out over the slow course of centuries, and the result is visible in the gnarled, spreading root systems that cover the forest floor from one end of the woodland to the other. To stand inside Aokigahara and look down is to see adaptation made physical, the record of a long negotiation between living wood and ungiving stone, written in the shape of every root that travels across the surface rather than into it. The canopy overhead belongs mostly to Japanese cypress and Mizunara oak, hinoki cypress, as the Japanese cypress is known, grows with a particular uprightness, its trunk rising cleanly before the branches begin, and in Aokigahara it forms a significant portion of the upper story, filtering the light that reaches the forest floor into something dim and diffuse by the time it arrives. Mizunara oak contributes a denser, rounder canopy mass, its broad leaves overlapping with those of its neighbors until very little of the sky remains visible from the ground. Between these dominant trees, Japanese hemlock stands in the mid-story, its slightly drooping branches creating a soft outline against the darker forms of the oaks, and momi fir fills other sections of the vertical space, its needles remaining green through the colder months when the deciduous trees above it have lost their leaves and the light reaching the floor briefly brightens. In spring and autumn, various maple species add their particular leaf shapes to the layered canopy, and the forest changes color at those edges in the way deciduous forests do, slowly, a few trees at a time, the change moving through the woodland with no clear beginning or end. Beneath the canopy, the understory holds a plant diversity that botanists have found worth careful attention. The conditions in Aokigahara are not obviously hospitable. The volcanic substrate is dense and hard, drainage is rapid, and the deep canopy shade limits the light available to plants growing close to the ground. And yet the species count in the understory is, by the standard of forests growing on more forgiving terrain, genuinely high. Mosses account for much of this. On the lava rock surfaces where no soil has accumulated, mosses establish themselves directly on the stone, building over decades a thin but persistent layer of organic material that can then support other small plants. Lichens do similar work on exposed rock faces, breaking down the mineral surface slowly and contributing to the gradual accumulation of material that will, over enough time, allow more demanding species to take hold. The ferns that grow throughout Aokigahara, some of them locally adapted forms found in relatively few other places, colonize crevices in the basalt and spread from there into any accumulation of decomposed organic matter they can find, their fronds filling the lower air of the forest with a soft, layered green that the filtered light catches and holds. The root systems of Aokigahara's trees are worth considering slowly because they are among the most visually distinctive features of the forest, and they tell a clear story about the conditions that produce them. A mature Mizunara oak growing in ordinary woodland soil would send its roots downward, anchoring in the earth below and drawing water from considerable depth. In Aokigahara, on basaltic lava, that downward path is closed. The root goes as far as it can, sometimes finding a fissure, sometimes entering a small pocket of accumulated soil, and then it turns, spreading laterally across the rock surface, branching and rebranching, finding every crack and irregularity the stone offers. Over many decades, as the tree grows and its root system expands, the surface around its base becomes a dense network of woody cables traveling in every direction, some of them thick as forearms, some fine enough to follow with a finger. Moss colonizes the roots themselves. Ferns root in the spaces between them. Small invertebrates move through the gaps. What begins as an adaptation to impenetrable substrate ends as habitat, a secondary environment created inadvertently by the roots as they searched for purchase on the stone. The Japanese sero moves through the more remote interior of Aokigahara with the careful, deliberate step of an animal that knows this terrain. It is a goat antelope, compact, dark-coated, with short curved horns and a thick neck, built for rocky slopes and dense woodland rather than open ground. In Japan, where it is endemic and protected, it inhabits the kind of terrain that larger, faster animals avoid: steep forested hillsides, boulder fields, the interiors of woodlands where the footing is uneven and visibility is short. Aokigahara suits it well. The lava rock beneath the moss and the roots creates exactly the kind of broken, irregular surface the Cerro navigates with ease, and the dense canopy provides the cover it prefers. Moving through the forest, a Cerro steps across the exposed root surfaces without disturbing the moss on them, its hooves finding the edges and irregularities of the lava with the confidence of an animal that has spent its life on surfaces like this. It pauses at intervals. It turns its head slowly. Then it continues deeper into the trees, and the forest closes around it without any sound. The Cerro has been a protected species in Japan since 1955, when its population had declined sufficiently under hunting pressure that formal protection was deemed necessary. In the decades since, numbers have recovered in several regions, including the mountainous terrain around Fuji and Aokigahara's interior. Remote enough that human disturbance is limited, provides the kind of undisturbed habitat the animal needs. It is not an animal that draws attention to itself. It does not move in groups. It does not call loudly. Within the forest's acoustic stillness, a Cerro might pass quite close to a stationary person and leave only the faint displacement of a fern frond or the brief settling of moss on a root as evidence of its passage. The copper pheasant occupies a different layer of the forest. Japan's largest native pheasant prefers the deep woodland interior. Unlike the more familiar common pheasant that tolerates open agricultural margins and forest edges, the copper pheasant is a bird of the forest proper, of hemlock understories and the shadow beneath dense conifer stands, of the specific low light that filters through closed canopies into the mid-story where it spends most of its time. The male carries plumage of deep russet and copper tones, his long tail feathers trailing behind him as he moves through the forest. In the filtered light of Aokigahara's interior, those warm colors appear briefly in a gap between the hemlock trunks, catching the pale downward light for a moment, and then he steps back into shadow and is gone. The female is more quietly colored, her brown tones making her nearly continuous with the mossy root surfaces and the dark bark of the trees around her. Both birds move through the forest floor and the lower mid-story with a deliberate, unhurried quality, picking through the accumulated organic matter for food, occasionally pausing to stand completely still. The copper pheasant is not commonly encountered, even in forests where its population is stable. It is a careful bird. It does not flush easily or fly far when it does. In Aokigahara, where the human presence is concentrated along the main trail network, the birds of the remote interior live largely undisturbed through most of the year, and the forest they inhabit is by any measure that matters to a pheasant an excellent one, dense, shaded, undisturbed, full of the invertebrates and plant material that make up its diet. What the forest's unusual geology means for a copper pheasant making its way through the hemlock understory is essentially nothing. The stone below the roots is not something it weighs or considers. The magnetic anomalies that trouble compasses are outside the range of anything it attends to. The forest is simply the forest, a layered, shaded, food-rich world that extends as far as it needs to go. Below the forest floor, below even the lateral roots that grip the lava surface, the volcanic rock is hollowed in places into long tubes and chambers. When lava flows and its outer surface cools and solidifies while the molten interior continues to move, it sometimes drains forward and downward, leaving behind an empty tube in the hardened shell. Aokigahara's lava field contains numerous such formations, cave systems of varying sizes, some accessible and documented, others smaller and opening only in narrow fissures at the forest surface. The caves beneath the forest stay cool through all seasons, maintaining temperatures well below the summer air above, and in winter they remain warmer than the frozen ground outside. This makes them desirable roosting sites for bat species that need stable thermal conditions, and several chiropteran species have been documented using the lava tubes beneath Aokigahara for exactly this purpose. Bats roost in the tubes during the day, hanging in darkness in chambers where the temperature is consistent and the humidity is high, and they emerge at dusk through the narrow openings in the forest floor, small, quick shapes dropping upward into the air between the trees and then dispersing into the canopy and beyond in search of insects. The openings through which they emerge are easy to miss. Some are barely visible beneath the moss that grows across the lava surface. Others are marked only by the slightly darker air of an opening in the rock, the edges furred with the same deep green as everything else around them. A bat finds its opening in the dark without hesitation, the echolocation that guides it through the night, also serving, on return, to locate the precise mouth of its roost tunnel in the patterned darkness of the forest floor. Before dawn, the bats come back. One by one, or in small clusters, they find their tunnel mouths and drop through the rock, disappearing from the forest above into the volcanic underworld below. The variety of bat species using these systems has been documented through survey work, though the full picture of what lives in the less accessible parts of the cave network is not yet complete. Survey methods for bat populations in cave systems typically involve mist netting at known roost entry points, acoustic monitoring of echolocation calls, and direct cave entry where passages are large enough to permit it. In Aokigahara, where some of the cave openings are narrow fissures, and where the network of tubes extends beyond what has been systematically mapped, the surveys that have been carried out represent a partial picture. What they confirm is that the lava tubes are genuinely occupied, genuinely diverse in their bat populations, and genuinely important as thermal refugia for animals that need stable conditions across the year. The forest above and the cave system below are, from the bat's perspective, a single habitat, the trees providing the night air through which they hunt, the lava the shelter in which they rest. Spring arrives in Aokigahara as it does in other closed canopy forests, slowly and first below. The persistent conifers, the hemlock and the firm on the cypress, hold their green through winter, so the change in season is not announced by the sudden return of color to a bare canopy. Instead, it arrives at ground level. The mosses, which have survived the cold months with their characteristic unhurried persistence, begin to brighten. The ferns that retreated into the crevices and the accumulated organic matter over winter send up new fronds, pale and tightly coiled at first, uncurling over days into the filtered light. In the spaces between roots where leaf litter has accumulated and partially decomposed over the colder months, small flowering plants begin to push through. The light reaching the forest floor briefly increases before the deciduous trees overhead fully leaf out, and in that narrow window, the understory plants that depend on spring light do their flowering quickly before the canopy closes again and the floor returns to its summer shade. The Mizunara oaks leaf out later than many of the species around them, which is characteristic of the genus. By the time an oak's leaves are fully expanded, the spring flush in the understory is already winding down, and the forest is settling into its summer mode: deep shade, steady canopy, the diffuse green light that reaches the floor too weak for most flowering plants, but sufficient for the mosses and ferns that are the floor's permanent residents. The forest in summer is the forest at its most uniform and most closed. The canopy overhead is a nearly unbroken surface. The floor is soft and green and still. The only sounds are the occasional calls of birds in the mid-story, the distant movement of a sparrow through the roots, the small sounds of invertebrate life in the leaf litter. The absence of wind at ground level, produced by the density of the canopy above, gives the summer forest an atmosphere of sustained quietness that is unlike most other woodland environments. Not silence in the absolute sense, there is always some small sound, but a particular quality of stillness that is the result of many sounds being absent together. Autumn changes the forest partially, but not completely. The maples turn first, their leaves going through yellow and orange before falling, and where maple species occur within the woodland, they provide a temporary overlay of warmer color against the permanent green of the conifers. The Mizunara oaks hold their leaves longer, going brown and rustling in whatever faint air movement reaches the forest floor, before releasing them in the weeks before the first hard frosts. The hemlock and the cypress and the fir remain as they were, green and still and continuous. By the time the deciduous trees are bare, the autumn light reaches the forest floor with slightly more directness than it did in summer, and the mosses and the remaining fern fronds hold what color they have against the new pallor of the season. Fallen leaves accumulate in the angles between roots and in the hollows of the lava surface, the beginning of the slow decomposition that will, over years and decades, add another thin layer to the accumulated organic material from which the forest's understory draws what sustenance it can. The relationship between the forest's living components and its volcanic substrate is not simply one of adaptation to difficult conditions. It is, more precisely, a relationship in which the living components have been slowly modifying the conditions themselves, turning bare lava into something marginally more hospitable over centuries of accumulation. The mosses that established themselves first on the bare rock released small amounts of acid as they grew, beginning the process of mineral breakdown that contributes to soil formation. When they died, they left organic material in the narrow spaces where they had grown, creating a substrate for the next generation of colonists. Ferns followed, and their decomposing fronds added more organic matter. Tree roots, finding fissures and crevices, expanded them slightly as they grew, breaking the rock surface in ways that allowed more material to accumulate. The forest that stands in Aokigahara today is in a meaningful sense the product of its own predecessors, each generation of plants making the environment slightly more workable for the next, the process continuing from the first seeds that arrived on the wind in the cooling decades after the Jogan eruption to the mature woodland visible today. This kind of gradual ecological succession is not unique to Aokigahara. It is a standard process in ecological science, the documented way in which bare rock becomes soil, becomes forest over long timescales. But Aokigahara offers a relatively rare opportunity to see the full arc of that process in a single place, because the lava field on which it grows is geologically recent enough that the successional history can be traced in the rock itself. In places where the lava surface is exposed, or where erosion has revealed cross-sections, the thin layer of accumulated organic material sits directly on bare basalt, the full depth of what the forest has managed to build in 11 centuries of slow work. It is not much measured in centimeters. It represents an enormous amount of accumulated biological effort measured in time. The invertebrate community of the forest floor is less well studied than the vertebrates, but it is not less important. Beetles, both larval and adult, work through the decomposing wood of fallen trees. Earthworms and other soil invertebrates, where the thin soil layer is sufficient to support them, aerate the accumulated organic matter and accelerate its decomposition. Spiders occupy the spaces between roots and the surfaces of the lava rock, building webs in the stable, windless air of the forest interior. Centipedes move through the leaf litter. In the cave systems below, adapted invertebrate species, some of them cave-specific, tolerating or depending on the darkness and stable temperatures of the lava tubes, contribute to a below-ground food web that is connected to the surface world only partially through the bats that move between the two domains and through the organic material that falls through fissures and accumulates in the cave chambers over time. The forest holds all of these communities: the serow in the remote interior, the copper pheasant in the hemlock understory, the mosses and ferns on the lava surface, the oak roots spreading across the stone, the bats in the volcanic darkness below, without any of them being fully visible to a visitor walking the main paths. A person moving through Aokigahara on an ordinary visit sees the moss, the roots, the filtered light, the close trunks of the trees. What they do not see is the extraordinary density of life concentrated in every layer of the forest, from the cave floors below to the canopy above, a density that exists precisely because the forest has been left alone long enough and has been stable enough in its conditions for complex communities to establish themselves across every available niche. The gnarled surface of the forest floor, which appears to many visitors as strange or somber, is in ecological terms a habitat matrix of considerable richness. Every gap between roots, a potential home; every patch of accumulated moss, a microhabitat supporting its own small community of organisms. The lava tubes themselves, beyond their function as bat roosts, are documented as hosting invertebrates specifically adapted to cave conditions. These include species that have evolved toward or into the full cave-adapted state that biologists describe: reduced eyes, elongated limbs, pale coloration, representing the outcome of populations isolated in cave environments long enough for natural selection to act on the traits that matter underground and relax its pressure on those that do not. A lava tube that has been sealed or semi-sealed for long enough becomes, for the organisms within it, an island, a discrete environment in which the population evolves independently of surface relatives, accumulating differences over generations in the dark. How many generations and how long Aokigahara's cave fauna has had to diverge depends on the age and history of the individual tubes, some of which have been accessible since the Jogan lava cooled, and others of which may have had their openings altered by later geological or biological events. The picture the cave surveys offer is partial, and the partial picture is already interesting. The forest's botanical diversity extends to species that are not common in the broader region. Among the fern species documented in Aokigahara are some that are considered locally rare, or that have their most significant regional populations within the forest, where the combination of high humidity, stable temperature, and lava rock substrate creates conditions that suit them better than the surrounding terrain does. The mosses show similar patterns. Some of the species most characteristic of the forest floor in Aokigahara are species that depend on particular combinations of moisture, shade, and mineral substrate that the volcanic woodland provides more consistently than other nearby environments. This gives Aokigahara a botanical importance that is independent of any other aspect of its character: the forest as a refuge for plant species that have fewer places to go as the surrounding landscape changes. In the deeper interior of the forest, where trails do not reach and human disturbance is minimal, the ecological communities are in a state that approaches what ecologists would call old-growth character, not in the strict sense of undisturbed primary forest. Since the lava field was bare rock until 11 centuries ago and cannot match the age of forests growing on older substrates, but in the sense of long established, complex, self sustaining community structure with minimal external disruption. The trees in the interior are old enough and large enough to be producing the standing dead wood and fallen logs that support the specialist species, fungi, beetles, bark dwelling invertebrates, cavity nesting birds that require that kind of material. The canopy is continuous and stable. The understory has had time to develop its full complement of shade-tolerant species. The lava tubes below have been occupied long enough for their fauna to specialize. These are the characteristics of a forest that has been left largely to itself, and in Aokigahara's case, the combination of terrain difficulty and cultural significance has contributed to that being exactly what has happened. Standing still in the forest interior, away from the trails, the experience of the place is less dominated by the visual than by the absence of the auditory. The acoustic qualities of Aokigahara that follow from its dense canopy and porous volcanic substrate, the near total suppression of wind at ground level, the elimination of flowing surface water, the physical absorption of sound by the deep moss, produce an environment in which the ear finds very little to work with. A bird calls somewhere in the mid-story, and the sound arrives cleanly, without echo or reverberation, and then it is gone. A root shifts slightly under a sero's hoof, somewhere out of sight, a single small sound, and then the stillness reasserts itself. The forest does not feel silent in the way a sealed room feels silent. There is no pressure to it, no sense of something being withheld. It feels quiet in the way that a place feels quiet when very little is actually happening, acoustically, when the sound sources are small and intermittent and the absorptive surfaces are everywhere. This is the forest as an ecological system, a community of extraordinary persistence and patient complexity, built layer by layer on unpromising stone, continuing its seasonal rhythms, without reference to the meanings that human culture has attributed to it. The sero does not know the forest is considered a liminal space. The copper pheasant in the hemlock shadow moves through a forest that is, for it, simply a forest, a place with food and cover, and the particular low light it prefers. The mosses growing across the basalt surface are responding to the humidity and mineral content of the rock, to the shade above them, and the water that filters through the porous stone below, to the slow processes of organic accumulation that have been building their substrate for centuries. None of what has been written or said or believed about this place is available to any of them, and the place they inhabit, the actual ecological forest, the living community of organisms in all its layered complexity, goes quietly about its business regardless. The seasonal round continues. The mosses persist through winter, dimmer but present. The ferns retreat and return. The oaks drop their leaves and leaf out again. The copper pheasant moves through the hemlock in December as it does in May, picking through whatever the litter offers. The sero finds its footing on the lava surfaces with the same deliberate care in the cold months as in the warm ones, and below the roots, below the basalt surface, below the thin accumulated layer of centuries of organic material, the bats sleep through the daylight hours in the stable darkness of the lava tubes, their small bodies hanging in the cool volcanic air, the forest above them going through its slow morning, the light arriving in the usual pale columns through the closed canopy, the moss holding the damp warmth of another quiet day beginning, before dawn, when the night insects are still active in the forest air above the canopy, and in the clearings at the forest's edge, the bats are still out. They move through the darkness with the precision of animals whose entire sensory orientation toward the world is acoustic, emitting, receiving, computing, the returning signals into a navigable map of the air around them, catching insects that are themselves invisible in the dark. One by one, as the eastern sky begins to lighten beyond the mountain, they return to the forest. The lava tube openings, which look in daylight like nothing more than dark spots in the mossy rock, look in the bat's sensory world like landmarks, acoustically distinctive points in the complex geometry of the forest floor's root surfaces and stone irregularities. Each bat finds its opening. Each one drops through from the cool morning air of the forest into the cooler, stiller air of the tube below, and settles into its roosting position in the dark. The moss above the tube mouth is undisturbed. The root of an oak crosses nearby, patient and lateral, holding the stone. The forest above continues without them. A fern frond holds a bead of night moisture at its tip, the droplet catching what little light has arrived through the canopy. The cerro, somewhere in the deep interior, begins its morning movement through the roots. The copper pheasant, invisible in the hemlock shadow, makes a single quiet call that travels a short distance through the still air and then is absorbed by the moss on the trees and the stone and the roots around it. The lava below holds its magnetic record of a volcanic event that ended more than 1,000 years ago, locked in the iron minerals of the cooling rock. The canopy above holds its green continuous surface across the full extent of the forest, filtering the growing light into the dim, diffuse illumination that reaches the floor as a general glow rather than a directed brightness. And the bats in the volcanic dark below the roots, and the moss and the sleeping forest above, settle quietly into the stillness of the stone, resting in the layers of the forest they cannot see but have always known. A compass needle, held flat in an open hand, points north. Outside the forest, on the path that runs along the edge of the lava plain at the northwestern base of Mount Fuji, the needle settles into its position with the calm authority of something that has never given anyone reason to doubt it. It drifts a fraction in either direction as the hand carrying it adjusts its angle, and then it returns. It is doing what compass needles do, which is the same thing they have done in every open field and on every clear road for centuries, pointing toward the planet's magnetic north with the untroubled reliability of a tool that works. A few steps further along the path, the trees begin. The canopy closes overhead. The light changes quality, going from open to filtered, from bright to a slow, diffuse green. The air goes still, and the compass needle, which was resting in its settled position a few moments ago, begins to do something different. It drifts, just slightly, past north, then it drifts back, then it drifts past north again, in the opposite direction, by a slightly wider margin. The movement is slow and unhurried, more like a hesitation than an error, but the hesitation does not resolve. The needle continues its indecisive arc, a few degrees left, a few degrees right, settling nowhere, while the hand holding it remains perfectly steady, and the trees stand absolutely still in the windless air. This is one of the oldest documented observations about Aokigahara. People have been noting it for well over a century. Hikers record it in journals, rangers mention it in operational briefings, and local emergency services include it in the guidance they give to anyone planning to enter the forest's interior. It is treated as a known characteristic of the place, as unremarkable in its way as the silence of the canopy or the particular quality of the filtered light, a feature of the environment that experienced visitors factor into their plans the same way they factor in the uniformity of the trees. The needle drifts, that is what it does here. The reason begins far below the forest floor. The lava that solidified beneath Aokigahara came from Mount Fuji during the Jogan eruption of 864 AD. That eruption was not the largest in Fuji's history, but it was extensive, and the flows that moved northwest from the volcano covered a substantial area of the terrain at the mountain's base. The lava that cooled across that terrain was basaltic, dark, iron-rich, dense in comparison to some other volcanic rock types, and carrying within its mineral composition a significant proportion of a substance called magnetite. Magnetite is an iron oxide mineral. It is one of the few naturally occurring materials on Earth that is itself magnetic, and the particular way it behaves during the cooling of volcanic rock makes it exceptionally relevant to what happens to a compass needle inside the forest. When molten basalt is flowing at temperatures of several hundred degrees, the magnetite crystals within it are not yet locked in any fixed orientation. They are suspended in the liquid rock, able to move. As the temperature drops and the lava begins to solidify, those crystals reach a specific threshold, the Curie temperature, somewhere around 580 degrees Celsius, and at that point they lock in place. What they lock into is an alignment with the Earth's magnetic field as it exists at that exact moment. The crystals become, in effect, a permanent record of the planet's magnetic orientation at the time the lava cooled. This happened across the entire Aokigahara lava field in the century following 864 AD. As each part of the flow cooled, the magnetite within it froze into alignment with the magnetic field of that era. The rock that formed became, in the aggregate, a permanent array of tiny magnets embedded in the ground beneath the forest, all oriented to a field that the Earth held over 1,000 years ago, and all still exerting their influence on any sensitive magnetic instrument that passes over them today. The Earth's magnetic field has shifted since then. Fields do shift over decades and centuries in patterns that geomagnetic researchers track with careful ongoing measurement. The direction that counted as magnetic north in 864 AD is not quite the same direction that counts as magnetic north now, and the magnetite locked into the Jogan lava field is indifferent to this drift. It is pointing where it was always pointing, toward a north it recorded in the cooling rock more than 12 centuries ago, and it has no mechanism for updating its orientation. It is not broken. It is simply old, and still, the result at ground level is a magnetic field that does not match what should be there. The deep background field of the Earth is present everywhere in the forest, but the lava beneath the trees adds its own contribution, local, irregular, varying in intensity and direction, depending on the exact composition and depth of rock at any given point. In some places, the lava is deeper and the surface anomaly is modest. In others, the basalt is close to the surface and the local magnetic signature is strong enough to pull a compass needle decisively away from the direction it would be pointing elsewhere. A hiker moving through the interior of the forest, checking their compass every 100 meters, would find the needle pointing in slightly different directions at each check, not dramatically, not spinning wildly as some accounts have it, but drifting, shifting, unreliably inconsistent in a way that makes using it as a sole navigational reference genuinely problematic over any significant distance. Geophysical surveys of the broader Mount Fuji volcanic region have confirmed this in quantitative terms. Ground-level measurements taken across the Aokigahara lava field have recorded local magnetic deviations that in some zones reach tens of degrees away from the regional baseline. Not a subtle effect on a sensitive instrument, but a measurable, mappable pattern of magnetic anomaly spread across the terrain. The surveys show that the anomaly is not uniform. It varies by zone, following the underlying distribution of the lava, with some areas showing stronger deviations and others less pronounced ones. The forest floor, from the point of view of a magnetic field sensor, is a quietly irregular surface. Its hidden topography visible only in the readings of instruments sensitive enough to detect it. GPS receivers face a somewhat different problem. The satellite signals that a GPS unit uses to establish its position travel through the atmosphere and reach the receiver from multiple directions. In open terrain, the calculation is straightforward. Inside a dense canopy like the one that covers Aokigahara, some of those signals are blocked or reflected by the massive trees overhead, and the receiver's ability to precisely triangulate its position is reduced. Reports of GPS units shifting indicated positions by tens of meters within the forest are consistent with this degradation in signal geometry, though the exact effect varies by device quality and the specific conditions of the canopy at any given point. The two navigational failures, compass drift from subsurface magnetite, GPS inaccuracy from canopy interference, compound each other in a way that makes the forest interior genuinely harder to navigate by instrument than most outdoor environments visitors encounter. The forest's effect on navigation does not stop with the instruments. A person standing in the middle of Aokigahara, looking for a visual landmark to orient themselves, is working with limited material. The trees are dense and visually similar in their spacing and character. The canopy filters the light into a diffuse, directionless quality that makes it difficult to determine where the sun is in the sky above. The ground offers the same surface in every direction: mossy volcanic rock, the lateral root systems of mature trees, fern growth in the crevices of basalt, and more trees. There are no clearings offering a sightline to a distance marker. There is no hill or ridge visible from the interior. There is no river to follow, no road audible in any direction, no sound of other human activity carrying through the dense canopy. The visual and acoustic landscape of the forest interior provides, for the human brain's spatial orientation systems, very little to work with. Research in environmental psychology has examined what happens to spatial reasoning in visually monotonous forest environments. The finding that emerges consistently from that work is that even without any navigational tool failure, such environments produce elevated rates of disorientation. The reason appears to be rooted in how the brain constructs spatial maps. The hippocampus, the structure most involved in navigation and the building of spatial memory, relies substantially on novel inputs to establish its maps. Distinct landmarks, varied terrain features, changing visual scenes as the navigator moves through a space. When those inputs are absent or repetitive, the map the brain builds is unreliable. A person who has walked for 20 minutes in a forest where every direction looks the same will frequently believe they are facing the direction they came from when they are actually facing sideways, or convince themselves they have traveled further than they have, or circle back toward a starting point while feeling certain they are moving directly away from it. In Aokigahara, this cognitive vulnerability is compounded by the elimination of the usual acoustic signals that help the brain orient itself without the person necessarily being aware of it. In almost any other outdoor environment, the brain is quietly using sound as a supplementary navigational system. There is road noise somewhere, growing louder as one moves towards civilization and fainter as one moves away. There is the sound of water, usually present in some direction, and water moves predictably to lower ground. Wind is audible, and its direction carries information. In the interior of Aokigahara, the canopy absorbs almost all ambient noise from beyond the forest, and the volcanic rock beneath the floor drains water downward silently rather than allowing it to collect in streams. The wind, which might be strong on the open slopes of Fuji just above, stops at the canopy. The result is an environment where the usual background network of acoustic cues, The kind the brain samples without any conscious effort is simply not operating. The Yamanashi Prefectural Police maintain records of search and rescue operations that reflect, in practical terms, what these combined navigational challenges produce. Their annual statistics, reviewed across multiple decades, consistently show that a significant proportion of the lost persons reported in the prefecture are found in or adjacent to Aokigahara. People enter the forest on short walks and do not return at the expected time. Groups that entered together are found separated. Visitors who brought a compass note that it was not useful in the way they expected. The pattern is consistent enough that local search and rescue teams have developed specific protocols for Aokigahara that they do not use in other forest environments, including, notably, a practice of laying out colored tape markers between trees as a physical trail record. Because the forest's documented tendency to produce instrument confusion and visual monotony has been enough to warrant a redundant physical system as a precautionary measure. None of this is presented by the teams who work there or by the geophysicists who have mapped the anomalies as mysterious in the sense of being outside explanation. The compass drifts because the magnetite in the lava pulls it. The GPS falters because the canopy degrades the signal geometry. The visual disorientation occurs because the forest's interior offers a nearly repetitive landscape with very limited spatial information. The auditory landscape is bare because the canopy absorbs sound and the volcanic rock eliminates streams. Each of these effects has a specific physical cause. What makes the forest unusual is not that these causes are unknown, but that they happen to coincide in the same place. A forest whose geology, botany, and acoustic properties combine to remove, one by one, most of the tools a person instinctively relies upon to understand where they are. It is worth spending a moment with the magnetic crystals themselves, not as an anomaly to be explained, but as objects with a long history of their own. The magnetite in the Aokigahara lava is not young. It has been locked in its orientation since the individual portions of the Jogan flow cooled through their Curie temperatures during the decades after 864 AD. In the time since then, the material world around it has been transformed many times. The bare lava field became a forest, slowly, over centuries. The forest matured, trees grew and fell and were replaced. Dynasties rose and fell in the capital to the east. Languages changed. The mountain above went through further eruptive cycles. Travelers of many different eras crossed the region, carrying different instruments, different maps, different understandings of how the world was arranged. Through all of it, the magnetite crystals in the rock held their orientation, pointing toward a magnetic north that the planet itself had since moved past, indifferent to the passage of time in the way that only rock can be. The specific direction they are pointing to, the magnetic north of 864 AD, is not dramatically different from the magnetic north of the present day. Geomagnetic drift is a slow process. The difference amounts to degrees, not a reversal. But in compass navigation, where the instrument is trusted to resolve ambiguity in conditions of poor visibility or uniform terrain, even a drift of several degrees in an unreliable and irregular direction is enough to make the compass a source of confusion rather than clarity. And the anomaly across the Aokigahara lava field is not uniform. It varies with the underlying geology, producing local deviations that do not follow any pattern a hiker could intuit or compensate for without detailed prior knowledge of the survey data. The compass is not pointing confidently in the wrong direction. It is pointing uncertainly in a direction that shifts as one moves, which is a harder thing to navigate around than a clean, consistent error. There is something particular about the combination of the forest's visual quality and its magnetic character that emerges when they are considered together. In almost any other environment where a compass becomes unreliable, the terrain offers other means of orientation: an open hillside, an ocean coastline, a meadow with a visible horizon. These offer sightlines and scale that allow a person to substitute visual reasoning for the failed instrument. Aokigahara closes those alternatives. The trees reach their canopy at a height that eliminates the sky as a reference plane in most of the interior. The terrain is flat, which removes slope as a cue. The uniform density of the woodland removes depth of field as a guide to direction. And the compass drifts not as a peripheral inconvenience against a rich background of other information, but at the center of a navigational environment that has already been stripped of most of its other data. Researchers who study the forest from a geophysical standpoint describe the magnetic anomaly as a genuinely elevated field variation compared to the surrounding region. Measurements taken in open ground near the forest boundary and then moved progressively into the interior show a consistent increase in local field irregularity as the lava density increases beneath the measuring equipment. The pattern follows the geology closely enough that a detailed magnetic survey of the area can be used as a proxy for mapping the underlying lava distribution. The strongest anomalies correspond to the zones where the original Jogan flow was deepest and where the basalt has had the longest time to settle into its permanent orientation. The forest has been mapped in this way, not extensively, but in documented geophysical surveys that contribute to the broader research literature on the magnetic characteristics of the Fuji volcanic region. The maps produced by those surveys show the invisible landscape beneath the visible one, a topography of magnetic intensity expressed in degree deviations and field strength variations, overlaid on the familiar contour of the 35 square kilometers of closed canopy that appears in ordinary maps. Held next to each other, the two maps describe the same place from entirely different vantage points, one showing the surface that a visitor walks through, the other showing the buried geology that is quietly influencing the instruments in their pocket. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from standing on a simple physical explanation and following its implications all the way out to the specific experience of a person holding a compass inside a forest. The Jogan eruption expelled iron-rich lava, the lava cooled, and its magnetite crystals froze into alignment. The alignment now deviates locally from the Earth's current field. The deviation pulls compass needles away from the position they would hold in unaffected terrain. The compass is therefore unreliable as a sole navigational tool in the interior. The forest's visual and acoustic properties simultaneously remove the supplementary cues that might compensate for that unreliability. The result is a forest where the experience of disorientation is, for a significant proportion of visitors, genuinely difficult to resolve, not because anything mysterious is at work, but because the geology, ecology, and acoustic character of the place have converged on an environment where the body's usual navigational systems are, in the specific and literal sense, not receiving the information they need. That is the whole of it. There is no remainder. The precision of the scientific account does not diminish what is interesting about it. A forest that preserves in its foundations the magnetic signature of a volcanic eruption from the 9th century, and in doing so affects the instruments of every visitor who carries a compass through it more than 1,200 years later. This is not a lesser thing for being explicable. The magnetite crystals are not dramatic. They are small, dark, iron oxide minerals distributed through basaltic rock, doing nothing more complex than holding the orientation they were given as the rock cooled. They have no awareness of the forest above them, or of the visitors whose compasses they disturb, or of the centuries that have passed since they locked into their current position. They are simply material, behaving according to the physics of magnetic minerals. And yet, the consequence of their existence, the specific, documented, mappable disturbance they create in the instruments of every person who carries a needle above them, is a direct line from a volcanic event in 864 AD to the hesitating compass needle in a hiker's palm on any given morning in the forest today. The lava cooled, the crystals froze, the needle drifts, the connection runs intact across 12 centuries, through the growth of an entire forest, through the accumulation of legend and literature, and the passage of every visitor who has tried to navigate the interior and found the usual tools unhelpful. The ground surveys that mapped the anomaly covered their area systematically, measuring at fixed intervals, recording the field strength and deviation at each point, building the invisible magnetic topography from the bottom up. The zones of strongest anomaly correspond to the areas of deepest lava concentration, where the basalt lies closest to the surface and its magnetite content is highest. The zones of weaker anomaly correspond to areas where the original flow was thinner or where later soil accumulation has placed more material between the surface and the rock. The map that results is not uniform. It is varied in the way that the geology beneath the forest is varied, irregular, patchy, following the contours of a lava field that spread unevenly across terrain that was itself not flat. A compass user moving through the forest would cross these zones without being aware of the transitions, feeling the needle settle briefly into something more consistent, and then drift again as the underlying magnetic character of the rock changes beneath their feet. There is no visible marker at the surface that corresponds to the zones of strong versus weak anomaly. The moss looks the same. The root systems of the trees extend laterally across the rock in the same gnarled pattern in both zones. The filtered light through the canopy is equally diffuse. The silence is equally complete. The anomaly zones exist in the geology, not in the landscape, and there is no way to feel them directly, only to notice that the needle has moved again, and that it has moved in a direction that does not correspond to any turn the carrier has made. For the search and rescue teams who work the forest regularly, this characteristic has moved from curiosity to operational consideration over the decades of accumulated experience. The preference for physical tape markers over instrument-dependent navigation during searches reflects a practical conclusion reached through repeated fieldwork that inside Aokigahara, the instruments are less trustworthy than in comparable forests elsewhere, and that a redundant physical system is worth the additional time it requires to deploy. This is not a policy based on folklore or precaution against the supernatural. It is a policy based on documented operational experience with a real geophysical effect in a real forest over a real span of years. The broader Fuji volcanic region offers geophysicists a range of sites where the magnetic effects of historical eruptions can be studied. Aokigahara is one of the more accessible of these, and the specific character of the Jogan lava, its age, its extent, its relatively uniform basaltic composition makes it a useful reference point in the study of how volcanic rock preserves geomagnetic signatures over long time periods. The forest has been the subject of dedicated magnetic surveys, as well as being included in broader regional geophysical assessments. The data from those surveys, combined with the detailed knowledge of the forest floor that comes from decades of search and rescue operations, provides a fairly complete picture of the navigational environment inside the trees. What that picture shows is a place where geology and ecology have collaborated without any intention on either's part to produce an environment that reliably challenges the navigational capacity of the humans who enter it. The basalt supplied the magnetic anomaly. The forest supplied the visual uniformity and the acoustic suppression. Neither was arranged with any human visitor in mind. Both are simply the result of a volcanic eruption and the 12 centuries of ecological succession that followed it, doing what lava fields and forests do when left to their own processes over sufficient time. The needle that drifted as the hiker entered the trees is in this sense responding to something enormously old. It is responding to a moment in the cooling of a specific flow of rock, in a specific hour of a specific year, more than 1,000 years ago, a moment when the temperature in the lava dropped through a threshold, and the crystals that had been floating freely in the melt settled into their permanent orientation with the planet's field. They have held that orientation through every season that the forest above them has experienced since, through every winter when snow accumulated on the closed canopy and then melted through the spring, through every summer when the trees above drew water upward through root systems extending across the rock surface in which the crystals are embedded, through every autumn when the maple leaves fell and broke down slowly into the thin organic soil accumulating in the crevices of the basalt. The crystals do not know this. They are rock. They hold their position because that is what magnetite crystals and cooled basalt do. And the needle drifts because it responds to what they are, with no knowledge of how far it has traveled from the last reliable magnetic reading or of how far it will need to go before the anomaly relents and north reasserts itself clearly. The geophysicists who map the field variation across the lava plain produce their data in the form of contour maps and measurement tables, the standard format for geomagnetic survey results. Translated out of that format and into the specific experience of standing in the forest, interior with a drifting needle and a canopy that blocks the sky, and a silence so complete that no directional sound reaches in from the world beyond the trees. The data means something more personally felt than a table of deviation values suggests. It means that the ground beneath the moss and the roots and the thin accumulating soil is an old archive, still active, still transmitting the magnetic record of the Jogan eruption across the gap of 12 centuries to every instrument sensitive enough to read it. That is what the needle is responding to in its slow and unhurried drift, not to anything present at the surface, not to the forest, the trees, the silence, or the centuries of accumulated story about this place. To the rock and to what the rock remembers about a morning in the 9th century when it was still cooling, when the crystals in it were just finding their rest, when the forest above had not yet begun to grow, and the mountain above that was quiet after its long expenditure of heat and stone and fire. The magnetite settled then into alignment with a field that the planet has since moved past. It has been pointing in that direction quietly through all the centuries since, through the slow arrival of the first mosses, through the gradual thickening of the canopy overhead, through the accumulation of every story and visit and documented survey, through every season of the forest in its present form, still pointing, still holding the record of that cooling, still tilting the needles of compasses carried by visitors who may have no particular reason to think about 9th century geomagnetic events as they walk between the trees. The needle drifts, the rock below remembers. The forest stands still around both of them in its customary silence on its ancient lava plain, with the closed canopy filtering the light to green and the hollow volcanic channels carrying whatever water falls silently downward through the dark stone, away from the surface, out of any hearing. What the magnetite crystals hold, locked in the basalt beneath the roots and the moss and the forest floor, is not a mystery. It is a record, specific, physical, measurable, and old, a record of where magnetic north was pointing on a morning more than 12 centuries ago, preserved in cooling rock with the perfect indifferent fidelity of a material that simply stopped moving at a particular moment and has not moved since. The surveys confirmed it. The measurements placed it on a map. The drifting needles of every compass carried through the forest interior have been corroborating it, one hesitant arc at a time, for as long as people have been bringing compasses into these trees. The lava cooled, the crystals froze into their orientation. The centuries passed, and the forest grew, and the anomaly remained, patient, unannounced, embedded in the ground beneath everything, still pointing toward a north that only the rock itself remembers. In the autumn of 1993, a book appeared on the shelves of Japanese bookshops with a plain cover and a title that translated, roughly, as The Complete Manual of Suicide. It was a small object, paperback, the kind of thing that could sit beside other books without drawing particular attention. On the other side of Japan, in Yamanashi Prefecture, at the northwestern base of Mount Fuji, the forest that the book would name as a suitable destination was doing what it had been doing for over 1,000 years. The trees were standing, the moss was growing, the lava beneath the roots was holding its cold magnetic memory of an eruption that no living person had witnessed. The forest continued its existence entirely unaware of what had been written about it, as forests do, as they always have. The book sold over 1 million copies. Its author, Wataru Tsurumi, had written it as a kind of social provocation, a response to what he saw as a society that demanded productivity from its members without offering them adequate reasons to continue. Whether that framing justified what the book became is a question that Japanese mental health researchers and government officials have been weighing ever since, and the weight of that question has not diminished with time. What the documented record shows is a measurable rise in deaths within Aokigahara following the book's publication, a correlation that researchers and officials have identified as more than coincidental. The forest's name was printed in the book's pages. Its name was on the lips of readers. And the forest, which had gathered myths and legends for centuries before any of this, received one more layer of story laid across its root-tangled floor. The story of how a place becomes famous for one thing when it contains many things is not a story unique to this forest. But Aokigahara offers a particularly clear example of how that process works, because the documentary record is detailed enough to trace. There is a moment in the 1960s when a novelist named Saiko Matsumoto published a mystery called Kuroijukai, which means Black Sea of Trees, and the final pages of that novel describe two fictional people walking into a real forest to die together. The novel was widely read. It was the kind of book that a country discusses for years after it appears, the kind that names something that had not quite been named before. Matsumoto was writing about longing and grief and the particular texture of a post-war Japan that was changing faster than its people could always follow. The forest was his chosen image for a certain kind of ending. What he could not fully have anticipated was how completely the image would take root, how the fictional lovers would join the older legends of Ubasute and Yurei and Shinto spirits until the layers became almost indistinguishable from one another. The literary and the folkloric and the mythological pressed together like the geological strata beneath the lava itself. Japanese scholars who study the relationship between literature and landscape have pointed to Kuroi-jukai as one of the clearest examples in modern Japanese cultural history of fiction shaping the way a real place is understood. This is not to say that the forest had no dark associations before 1960. The older traditions had been there for centuries. The Shinto understanding of dense woodland as a place where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world grew thin, the local oral stories of restless figures glimpsed at dusk, the legends attached to the forest's unusual silence. But Matsumoto gave all of that older material a contemporary emotional language, and the language spread. By the time Terumi's book appeared 33 years later, the forest already carried a significant literary weight. The 1993 publication added something more specific and more immediately consequential. It named the forest not as a backdrop for grief, but as a destination for it. The response from Japanese media and public institutions was significant, and it developed over years rather than all at once. Japanese television networks, including NHK, produced documentary coverage of the annual volunteer patrols that move through the forest each year in organized searches. The coverage prompted considerable internal debate within Japanese broadcasting about what responsible reporting on this subject required, what details served the public interest, and what details served only to amplify the associations that the coverage was, at some level, examining. Editorial guidelines emerged from that debate, restricting the specific information that could be included in reports about events within the forest. The guidelines were an acknowledgement that coverage of a place can change the place, that the act of description carries a kind of influence over what gets described, that language and landscape can become entangled in ways that matter in the most practical sense. Those guidelines represent one of the more thoughtful responses to a problem that media organizations covering Aokigahara have not always handled with equal care. International coverage, which arrived with particular intensity after the forest became more widely known outside Japan, has followed patterns that Japanese scholars and commentators have noted with some frustration. Travel writing about Aokigahara in publications including The Guardian, Vice, and National Geographic has concentrated almost entirely on the forest's associations with death, treating those associations as the whole story, as though the sero moving through the remote interior and the bats descending into their lava tube, roosts, and the copper pheasant stepping through the hemlock understory were details belonging to a different place entirely. The academic study of dark tourism, the phenomenon of people traveling to locations associated with tragedy or death, has identified Aokigahara as one of the clearest case studies in how a site's complex identity can be flattened by the accumulated weight of a single dominant narrative. What a place is known for is not always what a place is. The international journalism was not working in isolation. It arrived alongside and was shaped by the same broader cultural machinery that had been processing Aokigahara through fictional frames for decades. In 2015, a Hollywood film called The Forest was released, directed by Jason Zada and starring Natalie Dormer. The film used Aokigahara as a setting for a supernatural horror story, drawing on the forest's established mythology while adding new layers of specifically Western horror genre convention. Japanese commentators and cultural scholars were pointed in their criticism of the film, not primarily because it depicted supernatural events in a real place. That kind of imaginative use of location has a long tradition in Japanese culture itself, but because it did so with so little understanding of or interest in the specific cultural and historical context that had made the forest what it was. The forest in the film was interchangeable with any sufficiently atmospheric woodland. The particular quality of the place, its volcanic geology, its specific ecological character, the centuries of specifically Japanese mythological and literary accumulation had been replaced by generic atmospheric texture. The film reached a global audience that had no prior frame for understanding Aokigahara, and for many of those viewers, it became the primary reference point. A real and specific place had been converted into a backdrop. That process, the conversion of a specific place into a backdrop for stories that require only its atmosphere, had been underway in Japanese popular culture for considerably longer. Aokigahara has appeared in manga, in anime, in video games, in forms too numerous to catalog individually, always carrying some version of the supernatural and the tragic associations that earlier literary and folkloric sources established. Scholars of Japanese popular culture have noted the way each new fictional representation reinforces and expands the mythological framework so that the imagery becomes self-referential, new works drawing not directly from the forest itself, but from the accumulated store of previous representations. A video game designer studying photographs of Aokigahara's root-tangled floor and the pale filtered light of its interior is looking for specific visual textures to render into a virtual environment. Thousands of players will later walk through that rendered space, their experience of the forest shaped entirely by how its visual qualities were interpreted and translated by someone who may never have visited the place in person. This is not a criticism of game design. It is simply a description of how cultural transmission works, how a place moves outward from its physical location through successive layers of representation until it exists in forms its geography could not have anticipated. What persists through all of that transmission, if any attentive reader or viewer looks for it, is some quality of the actual forest that the representations keep finding useful. The silence, the visual uniformity of the interior, the same mossy roots and same filtered light in every direction. The sense of a place that exists outside ordinary rhythms of sound and orientation. These qualities are real. They are products of the basaltic lava substrate, the density of the canopy, the particular ecology that developed over 11 centuries on volcanic rock. The fictional versions of Aokigahara return to these qualities not because they are fictional, but because they are genuinely present. The horror genre reached for the forest because the forest is actually like that, actually that still, actually that disorienting in its visual repetition, actually that acoustically suppressed. The mythology found purchase there for the same reason. A place with those qualities invites a certain kind of imaginative attention, and the imaginative attention, over time, becomes part of the place's identity in ways that are difficult to separate from its physical character. There is a moment worth pausing over because it sits at the center of how Aokigahara has moved through Japanese and then international culture. It is the moment a reader in 1960 finished the final pages of Matsumoto's novel and closed the book. The story was over. The fictional lovers had walked into the forest. The reader was sitting wherever readers sit, in a kitchen, on a train, in a room with an autumn evening coming in at the window, and the forest's name was now part of their interior landscape. It would remain there. Years later, perhaps decades later, if that reader encountered the name Aokigahara in another context, something would shift in the quality of their attention. A slight change in register, a faint emotional color drawn from the novel's final pages. The forest at that same moment was continuing its existence on the slopes of Mount Fuji. The trees were not aware of their new literary role. The Zero in the remote interior was not aware of it. The mosses were growing at whatever rate mosses grow, which is slow enough that no single day represents a measurable advance. But something had changed in the relationship between that physical place and the country of people who shared a language and a literary culture, and the change was permanent. The volunteer patrols that move through Aokigahara annually are one of the most quietly significant features of the forest's contemporary reality. They are organized by local authorities and community groups, and the people who participate in them are doing practical work, searching the forest's interior for individuals who may be in distress, carrying out what is essentially a careful, systematic human presence in a place that can otherwise pass long periods without being walked by anyone who knows its interior well. The NHK documentaries about these patrols, which generated the editorial guidelines discussions, showed something that the horror films and the travel journalism tended not to show. Ordinary people in ordinary clothing moving carefully through an extraordinary place, doing something necessary and unglamorous and specific. The contrast between that footage and the imagery generated by the fictional representations of the forest is substantial. The patrol members were not navigating a supernatural landscape. They were navigating a dense, root-covered, acoustically suppressed woodland with unusual magnetic properties, carrying the practical knowledge of people who had done this before and would do it again. Yamanashi Prefectural Police maintain records of search and rescue operations within the forest, going back decades, and the annual statistics consistently show that a significant proportion of lost persons reported in the prefecture are found in or adjacent to Aokigahara. The forest is genuinely easy to become lost in. The visual uniformity of its interior, the suppression of sound that removes the directional cues of road noise and water, the magnetic anomalies that affect compass needles and GPS devices. These are not myths or literary constructions. They are documented features of a place built on highly magnetized basaltic lava beneath a canopy dense enough to block the wind. Getting lost in Aokigahara without proper preparation is not a metaphor. It is an outcome that local emergency services plan for each year with systematic, practical attention. The gap between the forest as it appears in media and the forest as local emergency services understand it is itself a kind of measure of how thoroughly the mythological and literary frameworks have shaped external perception. An international visitor arriving at Aokigahara after encountering it primarily through horror films or atmospheric travel journalism would have a set of expectations about the place that the patrol members and rescue personnel would recognize as significantly incomplete. The supernatural associations, the literary history, the darkness accumulated through decades of representation, these things are real as cultural facts. They describe something genuine about how the forest has been imagined and what it has come to mean. But the forest also contains a specific ecology, a specific geology, a specific annual rhythm of seasonal change, a specific community of species living in and on and beneath its volcanic substrate. And that dimension of the place has been consistently underweighted in the coverage that shaped international perception most forcefully. There is a patience required to hold both of those dimensions at once. The forest is genuinely a place where something terrible has happened many times. It is also, with equal genuineness, a place where copper pheasants move through the hemlock understory and bats descend at dusk into lava tube openings in the ground, and Mizunara oaks spread their roots across basalt surfaces in the long, slow work of holding on to volcanic rock. Neither of those realities cancels the other. The difficulty is that the dominant narratives about Aokigahara have tended to treat them as incompatible as though the ecological and the tragic could not coexist in the same place, as though acknowledging the bats and the sorrow somehow diminished the gravity of what has also occurred there, or conversely, as though the forest's associations with death made its natural dimensions somehow less real or less worth attention. The academic literature on dark tourism is useful here, not because it resolves the tension, but because it names it clearly. Researchers studying sites associated with tragedy, battlefields, sites of disaster, places that have accumulated associations with mortality through historical or contemporary events, have found that the way a site is framed in media and popular culture shapes visitor expectations and behavior in measurable ways. Places framed primarily as death sites attract a particular kind of attention that tends to suppress awareness of other dimensions of the place. This is not inevitable. Battlefields that have been in the ground long enough become meadows and woodlands, and people visit them with a layered awareness that holds both the historical event and the living landscape at once. Whether Aokigahara will develop toward that kind of layered public awareness, or whether the weight of the accumulated mythological and media framing will continue to dominate how the forest is known outside Japan, is a question that remains genuinely open. What the Japanese media guidelines represent, in this context, is a locally developed attempt to manage that tension with some deliberateness. The decision to restrict specific details in coverage of the forest was not a decision to pretend that deaths do not occur there. It was a decision that certain kinds of description carry a kind of gravitational pull, that naming specific locations and methods in a context of extensive media coverage can contribute to the very phenomenon the coverage is examining. This is a difficult editorial position to maintain because it requires ongoing judgment about where the line sits, and reasonable people can disagree about where that line should be. But the existence of the guidelines is itself evidence of a society thinking carefully about the relationship between language and place, about the responsibility that comes with the power to shape how a specific location is understood by millions of people who will never stand inside its tree line. The forest is old enough to have been through considerable changes in the culture that surrounds it. The Jogan eruption that created the lava field happened in 864 AD. The first seeds arrived on that cooling rock in the years and decades that followed, carried on the same winds that move freely across Fuji's open slopes. Vegetation colonized the hardened lava slowly, finding purchase in crevices too narrow to see from a standing position, accumulating over centuries into the continuous canopy that covers the full 35 square kilometers today. The forest that exists now is the product of 1,100 years of ecological work, and the myths and literary associations and media coverage and horror films and editorial guidelines are all, from that temporal perspective, very recent additions. They arrived in what amounts to the last few moments of the forest's existence so far. The hinoki and the Mizunara oak and the Japanese hemlock were growing on this lava field before the word Aokigahara existed, before there were Shinto priests performing purification rituals at the tree line, before Matsumoto put the forest's name on the cover of a novel, before a book appeared on a shelf in 1993 and sold 1 million copies. The trees do not carry the cultural weight that has been assigned to them. They carry something else, the slow accretion of organic matter in volcanic crevices, the lateral root systems gripping basalt surfaces in the long work of remaining upright, the seasonal shift from the pale filtered light of winter to the dense green shade of summer, the annual return of the copper pheasant and the sparrow and the bats finding their way back to the lava tubes at dawn. It is worth following that image for a moment, the bats returning at dawn to their roost sites in the lava tubes beneath the forest floor. They leave at dusk, dropping through the narrow tube openings in the basalt, moving out through the forest canopy, and beyond it into the open air above the lava plain. They spend the night doing what bats do, navigating in complete darkness with the precision of animals whose echolocation systems map their environment more accurately than most instruments humans have made for equivalent purposes. Before the light arrives, they begin to return, small shapes moving quickly through the pre-dawn air, finding their tube openings in the dark rock, dropping one by one through the narrow mouths in the ground and into the volcanic underworld beneath the roots and the moss and the sleeping forest above them. The lava tubes themselves are old. They are part of the original architecture of the 864 eruption, channels through which molten rock once moved, now cooled and hollow, running beneath the forest in a network that has never been fully mapped. Deeper in, the tubes are cold and dark and entirely beyond the reach of daylight. The bats know them. The bats have used them, or tubes like them, for as long as the forest has been a forest. The surveys that have been conducted identify multiple species, some more frequently documented than others, all of them making their lives in the volcanic underworld below a forest that the surface world has loaded with centuries of symbolic weight. The bats are not aware of the symbolic weight. They are aware of the echolocation returns from the tube walls, the temperature differential between the outside air and the interior of the rock, the specific quality of the opening as it appears to their senses in the dark. There is something useful in that image for anyone trying to understand what Aokigahara actually is beneath the layers of story. The forest that appears in horror films and travel journalism and decades of mythological accumulation is a real forest. Every atmospheric quality the representations reach for, the silence, the disorienting visual uniformity, the pale filtered light, the gnarled root surfaces, is genuinely there. The representations are not making things up. They are selecting, amplifying certain qualities and suppressing others, constructing a version of the place that serves the purposes of the genre or the story being told. The forest underneath the representations is larger and quieter and more various than any of the representations have managed to convey, not because the representations are false, but because no representation of a place is the same as the place itself. The volunteer patrol members who walk through Aokigahara each year know a forest that most of the film viewers and travel journalism readers do not. They know the specific visual texture of the ground after winter snow, the way the lateral roots across the basalt create a surface that requires particular care to cross without turning an ankle, the zones where the magnetic anomalies are more pronounced, and the zones where compass behavior is relatively stable, the sound of the canopy on the rare days when wind finds its way through, the long oceanic murmur from the hollow lava channels beneath the ground that old stories once described as something else. They know the forest as a physical environment that requires specific practical knowledge to move through safely. That knowledge is not incompatible with an awareness of the forest's cultural and historical dimensions. It is simply a different kind of knowing, grounded in the specific character of the place, rather than in the accumulated weight of its representations. The question of what Aokigahara will mean to the cultures that surround it in the coming decades is genuinely open. The editorial guidelines that emerged from the Japanese broadcasting debates represent a particular kind of institutional response, considered and deliberately maintained. The international coverage patterns represent a different set of pressures, shaped by the expectations of audiences who arrived at the forest through the horror genre or through dark tourism media and who want their expectations confirmed or interestingly complicated. The academic study of the forest's cultural history represents yet another mode of attention, slower and more systematic, interested in how the layers of representation accumulated and what they reveal about the societies that generated them. All of these forms of attention are real. All of them are in some relationship with the actual forest, the 35 square kilometers of volcanic woodland at the base of Fuji, where the trees are doing the work of being trees, and the moss is doing the work of being moss, and the sero is moving through the remote interior on its patient, sure-footed way. Somewhere in the forest tonight, if it is night there, which it probably is, the light has been gone for hours. The canopy blocks whatever moonlight might otherwise reach the ground. The forest floor is in a darkness so complete that the shape of a root a few centimeters away is invisible. The temperature has dropped. The forest is doing what forests do in the dark, the same things it does in daylight, only without light. The roots are holding the basalt. The moss is holding its moisture. The magnetite in the lava beneath the ground is pointing in the direction it has pointed since 864 AD, undisturbed by the centuries of stories told about the place above it. The copper pheasant is roosting somewhere in the hemlock understory. The bats have been in their lava tubes for hours, warm and still in the volcanic dark below the sleeping trees. The first light, when it comes, will arrive as it has always arrived here, slowly, filtered down through the density of the canopy, reaching the forest floor in pale, irregular columns that move across the mossy root surfaces as the angle of the light shifts. The hinoki and the Mizunara oak and the Japanese hemlock will absorb it. The ferns at the base of the trees, those small persistent plants that have found a way to live on the surface of volcanic rock, will absorb it. The forest will begin its daily work again. The photosynthesis and the root growth and the slow accumulation of organic material in the crevices of basalt that has been proceeding, with interruptions only for winter and drought, for 11 centuries. The stories that have been told about this place, the Shinto priests at the tree line, and the pale figures glimpsed at dusk, and the lovers in Matsumoto's novel, and the book on the shelf in 1993, and the horror film, and the travel journalism, and the editorial guidelines, and the volunteer patrols, the debate about dark tourism, and the academic papers studying the cross-cultural construction of site identity, all of those things are real. They are part of what Aokigahara is, part of what it has accumulated over the centuries, and especially over the last 60 years. The forest holds them the way it holds the magnetite in its lava, without intention, without comment, without the capacity to set any of it down. What the forest cannot hold is the meaning people have found in it, because meaning is not a property of forests. Meaning is what happens when a human mind encounters a place and brings everything it already knows and feels and fears to the encounter. The forest encounters the mind in return, and the encounter produces a story. The story joins all the other stories. The forest continues to be a forest,